6 years ago, my business partner disappeared without a trace. His car was found abandoned at a scenic overlook 40 miles from our office, driver's door open, engine still running, and no sign of him anywhere. No body, no note, and for 6 long years, absolutely no answers of any real kind. Last month, while clearing out an old storage closet in the building we used to share, I pried open a rusted floor safe hidden behind a false wall panel. Inside it was a single stock certificate, folded in thirds, worth $22 million. And taped to the back of it was a warning, written in his own unmistakable handwriting, 3 short sentences that I still haven't been able to fully shake, even now, months later. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. People ask me all the time how I ended up running a company alone for 6 years, still making payroll every other Friday for a business I never meant to carry by myself. The truth isn't glamorous. I didn't choose it. It was chosen for me, the morning a man I trusted more than almost anyone in my life simply stopped existing in it. My name is Maya Ellison. I'm 35, and I live in Portland, Oregon, in a rented townhouse 2 miles from the office I've kept open against every piece of sensible financial advice since the year everything changed. 10 years ago, I co-founded a small analytics company called Northbridge Metrics with a man named Daniel Voss, someone I'd met in a graduate statistics seminar and immediately recognized as smarter than almost anyone else in the room in that quiet, unshowy way that doesn't announce itself until you've watched it work for a while. He handled the technical architecture. I handled the clients, the contracts, the parts of running a company that required looking people in the eye and making promises we then had to keep. We weren't rich. We were scrappy and stubborn, and for about 4 years, genuinely happy with what we built together. Before Northbridge, my 20s had been a long string of jobs that never quite fit. 2 years at a mid-sized consulting firm where I watched other people get credit for work I'd quietly carried, a stint doing freelance data cleanup for clients who paid late or not at all, a brief and miserable year managing a nonprofit's donor database while my student loans compounded faster than I could chip away at them. My father used to call it finding yourself, in the gently condescending way parents do when they mean something closer to wasting time, and by the time I met Daniel in that graduate seminar, I'd more or less stopped defending myself against the implication. Meeting him felt, in a way I couldn't fully articulate at the time, like finally meeting someone who saw the same shape in my scattered skills that I'd been struggling to see myself. Daniel was private in a way I mistook, for a long time, for simple introversion. He didn't talk about his family. He rarely talked about money beyond what the business needed. He kept a locked drawer in his desk that I never once saw him open in front of another living person, and when I asked him about it early on, half joking, he told me it was just old hardware manuals, and something in his tone told me not to ask again. I let it go, the way you let a lot of things go with someone you've decided to trust completely. That decision would come back to haunt me in ways I couldn't have imagined at the time. The morning he disappeared started like any other. It was a Tuesday in March, cold and overcast, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that never quite commits to raining or clearing. Daniel had texted me at 7:15 to say he had an early meeting and would be in by 10. He never made it in. At 11, when he still hadn't answered his phone, I told myself he'd lost track of time, the way he sometimes did when he got pulled into a problem he couldn't put down. By 2 in the afternoon, I was calling hospitals. By 6, I was sitting in a folding chair at the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, filling out a missing persons report with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. They found his car the next morning, parked at Chanticleer Point along the Columbia River Highway, a scenic overlook popular with tourists and, according to the deputy who called me, Unfortunately, also a location with a history of jumpers. The driver's door had been left open. The engine had run itself out of gas sometime in the night. His phone was on the passenger seat, powered off. His wallet was still in the glove box, cash and cards untouched. There was no note, no witness, no security footage that caught anything beyond his car pulling in at 9:42 that morning and never pulling back out. The search that followed lasted 3 weeks. Divers in the gorge, volunteers combing the forest trails above the overlook, a helicopter sweep that turned up nothing but a hiker's lost dog. I spent most of those 3 weeks in a state I can only describe now as functioning without actually being present, standing at the edge of the search perimeter each morning in a borrowed rain jacket, watching strangers in orange vests move through the underbrush, calling a name that felt less real to me with every hour that passed. Volunteers brought coffee I didn't drink and sandwiches I didn't eat. A woman I'd never met held my hand for 20 minutes on the second day without either of us saying anything at all, and I still think about that small, wordless kindness more often than almost anything else from that entire spring. Nothing. No body ever surfaced. The investigating detective told me, with the practiced gentleness of someone who has delivered this exact speech many times before, that in a location like that, with currents like those, closure sometimes simply never comes. I heard the word presumed a great deal that spring, attached to words like accident and quieter, in the margins of conversations I wasn't meant to fully hear, the word suicide. I never believed either one completely, and I never had proof enough to argue against them either. I just had a hole where a person used to be, and a company that still needed to make payroll on Friday, whether I understood what had happened to my partner or not. I kept Northbridge alive out of something closer to stubbornness than strategy. I renegotiated our biggest contract myself, sitting across a table from a client who kept glancing at the empty chair beside me like Daniel might still walk in and rescue the meeting. I learned enough about the technical side, badly and slowly, to keep our existing product limping along, even as I turned away every ambitious new project we could no longer credibly deliver. 2 of our 5 employees left within the first year, understandably, for companies with steadier footing. I didn't blame them. Some mornings I wanted to leave too, and the only reason I didn't was that walking away from Northbridge felt like agreeing that Daniel was gone in every sense of the word, and some stubborn, unreasonable part of me still wasn't ready to agree to that. For 6 years, I ran a company that was really just the last visible trace of a person nobody could tell me anything definite about. I paid the lease on our small office suite above a bakery on Hawthorne Boulevard, mostly because Daniel's name was still on half the paperwork and changing it felt, irrationally, like erasing him. I kept a drawer of his old notebooks I never fully read, because reading them all the way through felt like something I wasn't ready for. I built a smaller, quieter version of the company we'd started, and told myself that was enough, because it had to be. The building's new owner gave us 90 days notice this past spring. The bakery downstairs was closing, the whole structure was being sold to a developer planning apartments, and every tenant above it needed to be out by early June. I'd been dreading the move for months, not because packing up a modest 2-room office was difficult, but because it meant finally clearing out the storage closet at the back of the suite, a narrow space, maybe 6 feet by 4, that Daniel had used for old hardware and file boxes, and that I had not fully opened since the week he vanished. I put it off until the second to last week before the deadline, the way you put off anything that scares you more than it should reasonably scare you. I remember standing in the doorway of that closet with a box of trash bags in one hand, telling myself it was just old routers and dusty banker's boxes, nothing more complicated than that. I was wrong within the first 20 minutes. Most of what I found was exactly what I'd expected: obsolete server equipment, tangled cable, a filing box of expired vendor contracts. But behind a stack of banker's boxes shoved against the back wall, I noticed something that didn't belong. A section of drywall that looked slightly different from the rest. A hairline seam running vertically where the texture didn't quite match, painted over carefully enough that you'd never notice unless you were standing close and looking for exactly that kind of thing. I told myself it was probably an old access panel for wiring, the kind builders leave behind in a lot of older commercial spaces. I told myself that for 2 days, working around it instead of through it, in the exact way I now recognize as a person avoiding something she already suspects is important. Then I got a flashlight and a flathead screwdriver and pried at the edge of that seam until a section of drywall, cut with more precision than any patch job I'd ever seen, came loose in my hands. Behind it wasn't wiring at all. It was a small floor safe, bolted into the concrete slab beneath the building, the kind of unit you'd buy for a home office rather than a corporate server closet, rust already beginning to bloom along its hinges from 6 years of sitting untouched behind a sealed wall. There was no keypad, just an old-fashioned combination dial, and for a moment I simply knelt there in the dust, staring at it, my heart doing something complicated in my chest. I didn't know the combination. I sat back on the dusty floor of that closet for a long moment, staring at the dial the way you stare at something you already suspect is about to rearrange your entire understanding of a person you thought you knew completely. Outside, I could hear the last of the bakery's ovens shutting down 2 floors below, that faint metallic ticking of cooling metal drifting up through the old building's floorboards, and some old, animal part of my brain told me that whatever was inside that safe was going to change the shape of my life in ways I wasn't ready for. Part of me genuinely did not want to open it. That's the honest version of it. I got the flashlight anyway. I sat with that safe for the rest of that afternoon, running through every number that meant anything to me about Daniel, his birthday, our incorporation date, the street address of the first apartment he'd rented after grad school, details I only half remembered from years of small talk over late nights, closing out fiscal quarters together. Nothing worked. It was past 9 that night, the bakery below long closed and dark, when I finally thought to try the numeric sequence from an old employee ID he'd used at his first job out of college, a detail I only remembered because he joked about it once, years earlier, calling it his lucky number. The dial gave, and the door swung open on hinges that groaned like they hadn't moved in exactly as long as I suspected they hadn't. Inside was a single manila envelope, and inside that, a stock certificate, the kind of physical paper certificate companies rarely issue anymore, printed with ornate borders and a raised company seal. It was issued in Daniel's name for a private company called Halcyon Genomic Systems, dated nearly 11 years earlier, before Northbridge had even existed. I didn't recognize the company name at first. I do now. Everyone does, whether they realize it or not, because Halcyon Genomic Systems became, under a different name after a series of mergers, one of the largest diagnostic technology firms on the West Coast, publicly traded, worth billions. I sat on the floor of that closet with my phone's calculator app open, converting the share count on that certificate against the current trading price of the company it had eventually become, and the number that came back made me put the phone down and simply breathe for a minute before I trusted myself to pick it back up and check the math again. $22,400,000. That was what the paper in my hands was currently worth, sitting untouched in a safe hidden behind a wall in a building Daniel and I had shared for years, a piece of his life he had never once mentioned to me in all the time I'd known him. Underneath the certificate, folded separately, was a single index card. His handwriting, unmistakable, tight and slightly slanted, the same handwriting I'd seen on 1,000 whiteboard equations over the years. It read, "If you found this, I couldn't protect it myself. Don't trust Victor. He'll come for it." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my dark office with the certificate on the desk in front of me and the index card beside it, running the name Victor through every memory I had of Daniel, trying to place it, and coming up mostly empty. Daniel had mentioned a Victor exactly once, years earlier, in the vague, dismissive way people mention someone from a former life they've deliberately closed the door on. An old investor, he'd said, when I'd asked, the same week we were finalizing Northbridge's own founding paperwork. Ancient history doesn't matter anymore. I hadn't pushed. I wished, sitting there 6 years later with his warning in my hands, that I had pushed a great deal harder. By morning, I understood I was standing at the edge of something far larger than a missing employee stock certificate. If Daniel had held a significant stake in a company that predated Northbridge entirely, one he'd never disclosed to me, one connected to a name he'd warned me about from beyond whatever had actually happened to him, then the legal question of who now owned $22 million in shares was about to become extremely complicated, and I had no idea yet whether I even had any legitimate claim to it at all. I called an attorney the next morning, a woman named Renata Suarez, who specialized in estate and probate disputes, referred to me by a client I trusted from an unrelated contract dispute years earlier. I told her everything over the phone in one long, unbroken rush: the disappearance, the safe, the certificate, the note about a man named Victor I'd never properly met. There was a pause on her end once I finally stopped talking. "Has Daniel Voss ever been legally declared dead?" she asked. I told her no, not that I knew of. The case had simply stayed open, unresolved, technically still active with no new developments in years. "Then here's your first problem," she said. "Under Oregon law, a missing person generally has to be absent and unaccounted for 7 years before a court will presume death for purposes of estate distribution. You're 1 year short. Until that happens, or until a court proceeding establishes otherwise, that certificate legally still belongs to a man the state considers, on paper, to still be alive." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was, I came to understand over the following weeks, the answer that gave me a chance to do this properly instead of quietly and quickly, the way I might have been tempted to if the paperwork had been simpler. Renata advised me to do 3 things immediately: photograph and document everything exactly as I'd found it, report the discovery formally to the original detective who had handled Daniel's case, and, above everything else, not tell a single other person about the certificate's value until she had a chance to understand the legal landscape I was standing in. $22 million, she said, has a way of making people reveal exactly who they really are. You want to know who those people are before they know you found this. Before I went anywhere near the sheriff's office again, I spent an afternoon at the downtown branch of the Multnomah County Library, pulling up old business journal archives on a public terminal, trying to understand who Victor Kessler actually was before I let anyone else know I'd found his name. A patient reference librarian named Dolores helped me track down a decade-old profile of him in a regional finance quarterly, a glowing piece about early biotech patronage that read, in hindsight, like it had been written entirely from Kessler's own talking points. There was a photo alongside the article, Kessler shaking hands with a much younger Preston Ames at some ribbon-cutting event, and I sat there staring at it for a long time, trying to imagine Daniel somewhere just outside the frame of that photograph, deliberately left out of a story that, according to the safe in my storage closet, he had actually helped build from the ground up. I filed the report the next day with Detective Aaron Cho, the same soft-spoken investigator who had led the original search 6 years earlier and had, in the years since, occasionally called just to tell me there was nothing new to report, a courtesy I genuinely appreciated even when it broke my heart a little every time. He listened to the entire story without interrupting, took the certificate and the index card into evidence for photographing, and then sat back in his chair with an expression I recognized instantly because I'd worn a similar one myself for the past 6 years, the look of someone recalculating everything they thought they understood about a case they believed had gone cold. "There's something you should know," he said, after a long moment. "About 2 years after Daniel disappeared, we got a call. Anonymous, male voice, wouldn't give a name, said Daniel Voss had, quote, taken something that wasn't his to take, and asked whether we'd found anything unusual in his personal effects. We logged it, followed up as far as we could with no name attached, and it went nowhere. I'd honestly forgotten about it until right now." He looked at the certificate, lying on the desk between us. I don't think I have any more. Someone had known, within 2 years of Daniel's disappearance, that there was something valuable connected to him that hadn't yet surfaced, which meant someone had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this moment, the moment it finally did. That night, sitting alone in my townhouse with every light on and the deadbolt thrown, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. I know you found Daniel's certificate. That was never his to keep, and it isn't yours to keep either. Return it, and this stays simple. I read it 4 times before I made myself move, then photographed the screen, forwarded it to Renata, and called Detective Cho, my voice coming out far steadier than I actually felt, which surprised me even as I heard myself doing it. Renata called back early the next morning with information she'd pulled overnight from public corporate filings. Halcyon Genomic Systems, before its eventual merger and rebrand, had been co-founded in its earliest seed stage by 2 men, a research scientist named Preston Ames, and an early financial backer named Victor Kessler, a name that hit me with a small, cold jolt of recognition, even though I'd never met the man in my life. Kessler, according to Renata's digging, had a long, quiet history of early-stage biotech investment, a reputation among people who'd worked with him for aggressive deal terms, and more troublingly, 2 prior civil suits from former business associates alleging he'd manipulated ownership records to inflate his own stake at their expense. Neither suit had gone to trial. Both had settled, quietly, with confidentiality clauses attached. Renata moved quickly once we had Kessler's name confirmed. She filed a protective motion asking the court to place the certificate under judicial custody pending a formal resolution of ownership, given the open missing persons case and the emerging question of a competing claim, and she flagged the threatening text for the district attorney's office in the same filing. The message had come from a prepaid number purchased with cash, untraceable through any normal channel, which told us, as Renata put it bluntly, that whoever sent it wasn't improvising. They'd been ready for this exact possibility for a long time. I stayed with my sister for the better part of a week after that, in her guest room in Beaverton, jumping at every unfamiliar car that idled too long on her street. I wasn't being paranoid without reason. I was being careful in the deliberate, exhausting way you have to be when someone has already told you, in writing, that they know exactly where to find you. Victor Kessler called me directly 5 days later. Block number, a voice that was calm in the specific way that always makes calm sound more threatening than shouting ever could. "Miss Ellison," he said, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation." I said nothing. The silence Renata had coached me to hold on to no matter how uncomfortable it felt. "Daniel and I had an arrangement, decades ago, that predates anything you know about your former partner," he continued. "That certificate represents an investment structure that was never fully settled between us. I'm not interested in a fight. I'm interested in what's fair." "Speak to my attorney," I said, and ended the call, my hands shaking only after I'd already hung up. I'd been recording every call since the first text, on Renata's instruction, and I sent the audio to her within minutes. Her read on the call was immediate and unambiguous. "He has no instrument he can bring into open court without exposing exactly what that old arrangement actually was," she told me that evening. "Which means he's going to keep trying other channels. Be careful and document everything." She was right, and I found out exactly how right 4 days later. I'd gone back to the office that Thursday to grab a client folder I needed for a meeting and found the back door of the suite standing open, the lock drilled clean through. Nothing of obvious value had been taken. The certificate itself was already sitting under court custody by then, moved out of the building entirely the week before, but every drawer in Daniel's old desk had been pulled open, his notebooks scattered across the floor, boxes I hadn't touched in 6 years tipped over and gone through with a thoroughness that made my skin crawl once I understood what I was looking at. Whoever had broken and hadn't been searching for the certificate Any reasonable person watching the situation closely enough to know I'd found it would also have known it was already out of the building, filed with the court. They'd been searching for something else. Proof, most likely, one way or the other, of whatever the actual terms of that decades-old arrangement between Daniel and Victor Kessler had really been. I stood in that ransacked office for a long time before I called anyone, staring at Daniel's notebooks scattered across a floor I'd swept 100 times over the years without ever really looking at what was underneath the surface of my own grief. If there was proof of what had actually happened between these two men, it was still out there somewhere, and now I understood, with a clarity that scared me more than the break-in itself, that I needed to find it before Kessler's people did. I gave myself the 3 days I always try to give myself when things get genuinely frightening, 3 days to be careful, to let people I trusted talk to me about ordinary things, to sleep in long stretches that felt like paying back a debt my body had been owed since the night I first found that safe. On the second night, I called my college roommate Priya, no relation to the prosecutor, a coincidence that made both of us laugh harder than it probably deserved once I explained it, and asked her to drive over just so I could sit across a table from someone who knew my actual face and not just my voice cracking over the phone. She showed up within the hour with takeout and absolutely no interest in advice, which was exactly what I needed. We talked for 3 hours about nothing that mattered and everything that did, and when she finally left, she hugged me at the door and said, "You have always been the most stubborn person I have ever met, and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." I laughed for what felt like the first time in weeks. It felt like coming up for air after holding my breath far too long. When the 3 days ended, I went back to work because work had always been the one thing that reliably organized my thinking when nothing else could. I searched the office methodically after that, room by room. The way I understood now, Daniel himself must have searched for the right hiding place all those years ago, carefully, patiently, in a way that assumed whoever eventually looked would need to work for it. I went through every one of his old notebooks page by page this time, something I'd never once let myself fully do in 6 years of missing him. I checked behind furniture, under floorboards near his old desk, inside the lining of an old duffel bag that had sat untouched in a supply closet since before he disappeared. I found it on a Sunday afternoon, tucked into a false bottom Daniel had built into an old aluminum filing box, the kind of modification you'd only discover if you were already looking hard enough to notice the box weighed more than it should have. 6 typed pages, dated 14 years earlier, an early-stage investment agreement between Daniel Voss and Victor Kessler regarding the seed funding of halcyon genomic systems. Once I understood the language, its real meaning became unmistakable. Daniel had approached Kessler as a private financial backer for Preston Ames's early genomic research, using capital that, according to a clause buried on the 4th page, Daniel himself had fronted from a separate personal source and structured through Kessler's name in order to keep his own involvement quiet from an employer he'd been working for at the time, a clear conflict of interest he'd apparently gone to significant lengths to hide. The agreement laid out a 60-40 ownership split favoring Daniel, with one clause that mattered more than any other on those 6 pages. If either party became legally unreachable for an extended period without formal transfer of their interest, the other party's authority over jointly held shares would remain strictly limited to voting rights only, with ownership itself explicitly, permanently non-transferable without a signed release from the absent party or a court order confirming their death. I sat with that clause for a long time before I fully understood what it meant. Victor Kessler had never had any legal path to simply claim Daniel's shares, not through waiting, not through pressure, not through anything short of a court declaring Daniel legally dead and a formal probate process distributing the estate through proper channels, which meant every call, every text, every break-in had been an attempt to get me to hand something over that he had no legitimate way of taking through the system that actually governed it. I photographed every page and called Renata immediately. She was quiet on the line for a moment after I read her the key clause. "Maya, this changes everything," she finally said. But you need to understand what it also confirms. This document proves Kessler has spent 6 years applying illegal pressure to obtain shares he has no lawful claim to, regardless of what happens with Daniel's case. Once we hand this over, it's not just a probate matter anymore. It becomes a criminal one. 2 days later, I sat across a conference table from an assistant district attorney named Priya Nair, a precise, unhurried woman who walked me through the same story a third time with a level of care that finally made me feel like the machinery of the system was actually working the way it was supposed to. She asked better, sharper questions in 40 minutes than anyone else had managed to ask me in the entire ordeal up to that point, circling back twice to small details I hadn't thought mattered, the exact wording of Rachel's introduction at the office visit, the precise date stamped on the false bottom filing box, until I understood she wasn't just building a case. She was building it carefully enough that nothing could come apart later under pressure. I handed over the investment agreement, photographs from inside the safe, the recording of Kessler's call, and full documentation of the break-in. She thanked me, told me she'd be in touch soon, and I walked out into a gray Portland afternoon that felt, for the first time in weeks, like it might eventually clear on its own. Kessler came to my office himself on a Tuesday morning. 3 weeks later, no warning, no appointment. I recognized him immediately from the photo Renata had pulled from an old business journal profile. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in the understated, expensive way that money that's been around a long time tends to dress. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood a younger man he introduced as his attorney, and a woman he introduced, with a small, practiced softening of his voice, as Daniel's estranged half-sister, Rachel Voss, someone I hadn't even known existed in 6 years of quietly assuming Daniel had no family left to notify. "Miss Ellison," Kessler said. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I thought it was past time we spoke honestly, all of us in person." Rachel offered a look of careful, rehearsed sorrow. "Daniel and I weren't close," she said, "but I'm still his family. I have every right to be part of this conversation, whatever you and Victor decide between you." I said nothing at first. Silence, I'd learned by then, carried more weight than almost anything I could say back. Kessler continued, his voice pitched to sound entirely reasonable. "My investment built the foundation Daniel's fortune sits on. I'm not disputing the paperwork's technical language. I'm asking you to see the fairness underneath it. A settlement, negotiated quietly among the people who actually knew him, is a far better outcome than years of litigation that helps no one but lawyers." He spread his hands, palms up, the gesture of a man offering something generous. "Half! That's all I'm asking. A clean, private resolution. You keep the rest. No more court, no more stress for anyone involved." "That's an interesting offer," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, from a man whose attorney filed a motion last week to have this exact investment agreement excluded from any future proceeding entirely. The attorney's composure flickered, just slightly. "Those are separate legal strategies," he said quickly. "They're not," I said. "If you actually believe this offer was fair, you'd be making it in front of a judge on the record. You're standing in my office instead because you've already been told you can't win there." Rachel's expression shifted, the sorrow curdling fast into something colder. "You're making a serious mistake," she said. "Victor has relationships in this city that go back decades. You're one small business owner standing alone against people with real resources, and people like you tend to regret betting against them." "Rachel," Kessler said sharply, but the mask had already slipped, and all 4 of us in that small office knew it. "I think you should all leave," I said. Kessler studied me for a long moment, something colder and more calculating moving behind his controlled expression, the look of a man doing arithmetic on his own losses in real time. Then he nodded once, turned, and the 3 of them walked out past our small reception area and down the stairs to the street, the bell over the door ringing once, absurdly cheerful in the silence they left behind. I stood in that office, A long time after the sound of their car pulling away had faded completely. My hands were steady. My heart, again, was not. I'd expected some version of that meeting. A familiar face brought along for sympathy, an offer built to sound reasonable on its surface. What I hadn't expected was how transparent the entire performance would feel once I was standing inside it, or how clearly I could see the calculation running underneath every carefully chosen word. Rachel's parting line stayed with me the longest. People like you tend to regret betting against them. It wasn't something a judge could act on by itself, but it landed exactly the way it was meant to land, and I stood in my own front office for a long 5 minutes afterward, breathing, reminding myself that fear and good judgment are not the same thing, even when fear is loud enough to drown out almost everything else. I called Renata and relayed the entire conversation, including Rachel's closing line. To my surprise, she sounded almost pleased once I finished. "That's genuinely useful for us," she said. When I told her it hadn't felt useful at all, sitting inside it, she explained. An implied threat delivered directly to you, on top of the break-in and the earlier calls, tells a prosecutor this isn't a grieving family navigating a legitimate claim through the wrong channel. It's a coordinated effort to pressure someone standing between a man and money he already knows he can't win through legal means. The weeks that followed went quiet the way Renata had warned me they might. No calls, no more visits, nothing but the ordinary, exhausting rhythm of running a business and waiting for a court date. A hearing was eventually scheduled for late autumn, by which point the district attorney's office had been investigating for nearly 2 months, and, in Priya Nair's careful phrasing over the phone, the investigation had turned genuinely productive. I wouldn't understand exactly how productive until I was sitting in that courtroom myself, in the same blazer I'd worn to every important meeting of my professional life, feeling strangely, unexpectedly calm. Not the performed kind of calm you put on for other people in a room like that, but the real thing, the specific steadiness that only arrives after you've done every single thing within your own power, and there's genuinely nothing left to do but sit and watch the rest of it unfold. Victor Kessler sat across the aisle beside his attorney, composed, dressed impeccably, wearing the particular expression of a man who has convinced himself he is the wronged party and is simply waiting, patiently, for everyone else in the room to catch up to that understanding. Priya Nair walked the judge methodically through the entire timeline, the discovery of the safe, the certificate, the threatening text, the break-in, the recovery of the original investment agreement, the meeting in my office with Kessler, his attorney, and Rachel Voss. Then she introduced something I hadn't been told to expect. A witness, a retired venture accountant named Harold Fenn, 71 years old, testifying under a limited immunity agreement about his first-hand knowledge, decades earlier, of exactly how Kessler had structured his early investments across several biotech ventures, Halcyon among them. Fenn described the mechanics in plain, unhurried language, the way a man describes work he did a long time ago and has clearly thought about often since, how ownership percentages had quietly shifted on paper without matching changes in actual capital contribution, how at least 2 other early partners of Kessler's had eventually settled disputes out of court rather than face the cost of fighting him, and how, in Fenn's own words, everyone in that world knew Victor's real talent wasn't finding good science. It was finding people too trusting or too tired to check his math. He named Daniel Voss specifically as one of the original architects of the Halcyon funding structure and confirmed, under direct questioning, that Daniel had confided in him privately, years before he disappeared, that he was afraid of what Kessler might do if he ever tried to formally document and protect his own share of the company in writing. Kessler's attorney went very still. Kessler leaned over and murmured something to him, and the attorney gave a small, barely perceptible shake of his head. Priya wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she continued, "the state would also like to note that a second witness, under a separate immunity agreement, has corroborated Mr. Fenn's account and additionally provided documentation showing that Victor Kessler was in direct contact with Daniel Voss's phone number as recently as the week before Mr. Voss disappeared, a fact he never once disclosed to investigators during the original missing persons inquiry 6 years ago. The room went very still. I felt something in my chest tighten in a way I hadn't fully braced myself for. Detective Cho, seated a few rows behind me, leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening in a way I recognized from 6 years of watching him work Daniel's case with a patience that had never once wavered, even when I'd started to lose mine. I realized, sitting there with my hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench, that some part of me had spent 6 years quietly bracing for exactly this moment without ever letting myself admit it. The moment someone in a position of real authority looked at Victor Kessler and saw, finally, the same shape I had started to see in him the night that first threatening text arrived on my phone. Kessler's attorney requested a brief recess before cross-examination, and the judge granted it. I stepped out into the hallway with Renata, my legs unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with how long I'd been sitting. "You don't have to say anything else today," she told me quietly. "The hardest part of your part in this is already finished." I believed her, mostly, though it would be several more months before I understood just how true that turned out to be. The judge addressed Kessler's attorney directly, asking pointedly why this contact had never surfaced in 6 years of an open investigation, and noted for the record that the matter would be formally referred to Detective Cho's office for reopening as part of the ongoing missing persons case, separate entirely from the civil proceeding over the shares themselves. Kessler's composure didn't shatter outright, but I watched something behind it change, controlled stillness sliding slowly into something closer to frozen stone. The months that followed moved with the slow, relentless mechanics of the legal system, on 2 separate but suddenly connected tracks. Kessler retained additional counsel for what was quickly becoming a far more serious matter than a civil dispute over stock ownership, and according to Renata, spent a significant amount of that new counsel's energy quietly probing for any kind of resolution once Fenn's testimony and the phone records proved impossible to argue around convincingly. There wasn't much room left to maneuver. Kessler was charged with witness intimidation and obstruction related to the missing persons investigation, and separately, in a civil filing Renata pursued on my behalf, with fraudulent interference in the rightful administration of Daniel's estate. In February, nearly a year after I first pried open that section of drywall, he pleaded guilty to obstruction. He was fined $400,000 and given 2 years of supervised release. He didn't go to prison for that charge, and I won't pretend that didn't sit uneasily with me for a while, the sense that the consequence still didn't fully match everything he'd put me through, or everything he might have done to Daniel himself, a question that, 6 years on, I understood might genuinely never receive a final answer. Renata reminded me, gently but firmly, that supervised release and a felony obstruction record were far from nothing for a man whose entire career had depended on institutional trust and access to capital markets that don't forgive that kind of finding easily. She turned out to be right about that, too. Within a year, 2 of his remaining fund partnerships dissolved, several longtime investors quietly withdrew their commitments, and by the following autumn his firm had wound down operations entirely, a collapse that had nothing to do with anything I personally did and everything to do with the simple, patient arithmetic of consequences finally catching up to choices made long before I ever pried open that wall. The formal court determination on the certificate itself came through the following spring, once the 7-year threshold for a legal presumption of death was reached, and Renata petitioned the probate court to finally resolve the estate. Under Oregon law, and under the clear, unambiguous language of the original investment agreement Daniel had hidden in that false-bottomed filing box, his shares in Halcyon transferred to his estate in full, with no valid competing claim remaining from Kessler, whose entire 6-year campaign the court explicitly characterized, in its written ruling, as a documented pattern of coercion undertaken specifically because the claimant possessed no lawful ownership interest whatsoever. Rachel Voss, as Daniel's only surviving blood relative, was named administrator of an estate she had shown essentially no interest in before those shares surfaced, and under Oregon intestacy law she stood to inherit the majority of it directly. It was, I understood, sitting in that courtroom hearing the ruling read aloud, a genuinely fair outcome by the letter of the law, whatever complicated feelings I still carried about the woman standing beside Kessler's attorney on the worst afternoon of that whole ordeal. But Renata had found one more document during discovery that changed even that calculation, a handwritten codicil, dated the same week Daniel and I had signed Northbridge's founding paperwork, naming me as a partial beneficiary of any assets connected to his prior undisclosed business interests in the event anything ever happened to him, a document he had apparently drafted and witnessed quietly, on his own, without ever once mentioning it to me. I read that codicil 3 times before it felt real, sitting in Renata's office with the document trembling slightly in my hands, half expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something less generous every time I looked away and back. I called Renata from my car outside the courthouse and said something completely incoherent, and she laughed, gently, and told me I'd more than earned whatever came of it. The final distribution, once probate concluded that summer, allotted me 30% of the Halcyon shares in my own name, a figure that still, even now, takes my breath away a little every time I let myself think about it directly instead of glancing past it the way I usually do. I finished clearing out that old storage closet the following week, nearly a full year after I'd first pried a section of drywall loose and found a safe nobody was ever supposed to find. I kept the empty floor safe itself, cleaned and oiled, sitting now in the corner of my new, larger office a few blocks from where the old one used to be. Not for any sentimental reason I can fully explain. Just as a reminder that I got through something I never expected to survive, and that the people who try hardest to take something from you are so often the same people who never had any real claim to it in the first place. With the settlement, I did what I'd been quietly dreaming about doing for longer than I ever let myself admit out loud. I restructured Northbridge into a proper analytics and forensic accounting consultancy, one that specifically takes on cases involving disputed ownership structures and hidden asset investigations, work that grew directly, unmistakably, out of everything I'd had to learn the hard way over the past year. Within the first year, we had 11 active cases. By the second, we'd hired 4 new analysts, including, eventually, Harold Fenn himself, semi-retired but glad, he told me, to finally use everything he knew for something that actually mattered to him. I established a modest scholarship in Daniel's name at the university where we'd met, funding graduate students in applied statistics who need the kind of quiet, unglamorous support that lets brilliant, private people build the kind of work that speaks for itself. It was the first thing I did with the money that felt entirely, uncomplicatedly good, no legal complexity attached to it at all. I'd paid off the last of my student loans within the first month, something I'd been chipping away at for over a decade with a stubbornness that never quite matched the size of the balance. My mother, who had spent years gently suggesting I consider something with a pension, every time I mentioned how tight things were at Northbridge, cried on the phone when I told her, and then immediately asked whether this meant I'd finally come visit for more than a single rushed holiday weekend. I told her yes, and I meant it, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I actually kept that promise. My younger brother, who had spent years sending me job postings for stable analyst positions with the same gentle, well-meaning persistence Kessler's attorney had once tried to pass off as reasonableness, finally stopped, and told me at Thanksgiving that he'd never once doubted I'd figure it out, a claim we both knew wasn't entirely true, but that I let him have anyway because some kindnesses are worth more than their accuracy. Detective Cho's office reopened Daniel's missing persons case formally that autumn, working now from the phone records and the newly established timeline of his final contact with Kessler in the days before he disappeared. There's still no final answer, 6 years on, and I've made a slow, deliberate kind of peace with the possibility that there may never be one. But I know now, in a way I didn't before, that whatever happened to Daniel, he spent his last documented days trying to protect something rather than simply running from it, and that matters to me more than I expected it to when I first started looking for it. I think about Rachel sometimes, the half-sister I never knew existed until money made her suddenly, urgently interested in a brother she'd shown no curiosity about for years. We settled the estate through lawyers, cordially enough, and I haven't spoken to her since. I don't wish her harm. I also don't spend much time wishing her well. She's a chapter one occasionally remember exists, filed somewhere I don't visit often, the same way I imagine she rarely thinks of me except when a tax document happens to arrive with both our names printed on it. Victor Kessler's firm dissolved entirely by the following winter, and I understand secondhand that he's since left the state altogether. I don't know exactly where he ended up, and I've made a conscious decision not to look. Whatever the rest of his life looks like from here isn't something I carry with me anymore, and I find I mean that more fully with each month that passes, in a way I couldn't have honestly claimed even a year ago, when his name alone was still enough to make my hands go cold. I sat in my new office one evening this past spring, long after everyone else had gone home, a cup of tea going lukewarm on the desk beside me, looking at that old floor safe sitting empty in the corner where I'd chosen to keep it. Almost exactly a year had passed since I first knelt in that dusty storage closet and felt a section of drywall give beneath my hands in a way it shouldn't have. The company down the hall is quieter now, steadier, built on work I actually understand from the ground up instead of work I was only ever half carrying alone. I found $22 million in shares hidden behind a wall my missing business partner built with his own hands, sometime before I ever knew him well enough to notice what he was protecting himself from. I was threatened, broken into, and pressured by a man with more money and more institutional power than I'd ever personally had in my life, and I was still standing at the end of it, in an office I'd rebuilt from the ground up, with my own name properly on every piece of paper that mattered, and no one left who could quietly take any of it away from me. Daniel left 3 words on an index card in the dark. Don't trust Victor. I think, in the end, he meant it as more than a warning about one specific man chasing one specific fortune. I think he meant, in whatever way a person who fears he's running out of time can leave a message for whoever eventually finds it, protect what's actually yours, even when protecting it costs you everything you thought you understood about the people around you. I didn't run from what I found under that wall, but I didn't let the fear make my decisions for me either. I documented everything, trusted the right people, and took it one careful, deliberate step at a time. That's really the whole lesson, if there is one. Not bravery, exactly. Just a stubborn, methodical refusal to be pushed around by people who assumed, wrongly, that I wouldn't fight back for something that was never rightfully theirs to take, and who never once considered that the quiet, exhausted woman running a small company alone might actually be the last person they should have underestimated. So tell me, what would you have done? A hidden fortune behind your own office wall, a warning about a man you'd never met, and that same man showing up in person to ask for half of what a court would later confirm was never his to claim? Would you have handed it over to make the pressure stop, or would you have stayed and fought for what the paperwork actually said? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story kept you here until the very end, you know what to do. Subscribe to Kate's Fortune Stories, because there's always another one waiting. Thank you so much, truly, for listening all the way to the end.